Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for being there. This is session 11 of the PWL International Seminar, the permanent seminar of the FCT-funded project Mapping Philosophy as a Way of Life, an Ancient Model, a Contemporary Approach, which is run by IFILNOVA at the Nova University of Lisbon. And today we have a very dear and special guest who will give his talk from Tokyo, and it's 11 p.m. there. So first of all, thank you so much, Daniele, for accepting to give your talk so late in the evening. I'm sure most of you know Daniele Lorenzini and his work very well, so I will introduce him very, very briefly. Daniele Lorenzini is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. He specializes in post-Kantian European philosophy, social and political philosophy, and early analytic philosophy. He has an extremely long list of publications and is the author of several books, including the most recent, The Force of Truth, Critique, Genealogy, and Truth-Telling in Michel Foucault, published by University of Chicago Press last year, 2023. He's also co-editor of Foucault Studies and of two book series, Philosophie du Présent with Brun, and the Chicago Foucault Project with University of Chicago Press. He is a renowned expert in the work of Michel Foucault and has worked a lot on the question of truth, practices of the self, and genealogy, often in connection with other authors such as Austin, Hadot, Cavell, and also Nietzsche. And his talk today will focus precisely on Nietzsche. The title is Genealogical Perfectionism, Nietzsche's Genealogy as a Perfectionist Endeavor. So without further ado, I will give him the word. So Danielle, thank you so much for being there, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Marta, for inviting me, and everybody also just for being here. I think that this is a great project. I'm very happy to give this talk and to contribute to this seminar. So let me now share for good my PowerPoint. Okay. And okay. Can you see it? Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay,
Perfect.
great. So I'm going to present a paper that I have to slightly rework in view of publication in a couple of months. So I thought that it was at the same time a good fit for the seminar and very selfishly, helpful for me to present in order to get your comments and feedback, which is going to be very, very helpful for me. So genealogy, in its subversive or critical form, can be defined as a narrative describing how a given target, can be a belief, a concept, a practice, or a set thereof, has come about, thereby aiming to undermine its current value. In his Genealogy of Morality, Nietzsche famously offers a genealogical narrative accounting for the emergence and success of Christian moral values. He argues that they originated in something that Christian morality itself would find despicable, namely the ressentiment of slaves directed against their masters, and that they had such a lasting success because they constituted the will of power of the majority of people as a trick for the preservation of life. Far from being God-given, Christian morality is thus, according to Nietzsche, a human creation, and one that, according to him, can no longer fulfill its aim, but has instead become dangerous for the flourishing of human beings in an age of nihilism. The goal of critical genealogies, as Nietzsche's genealogy clearly shows, is therefore to undermine the confidence of their readers in the current value of the genealogy's target, to instill, in other words, in their readers a sense of contingency, not only in relation to their past history, things could have gone differently, but also with regard to their present and to their future. Things can and perhaps must change if they no longer have the function that made them valuable in the first place. Critical genealogies never operate exclusively, and sometimes they do not operate at all, on an epistemic level. If they aim to undermine the current value of a given set of beliefs, say the belief set of Christian morality, it is by inducing in the reader a sense of dissatisfaction towards those beliefs. They are not God-given and in fact rely on a set of presuppositions that they explicitly condemn. Thus, the genealogy incites its reader to reject the target belief set and transform her way of living and the world in which she lives. Most of the time, however, and certainly when it comes to the two main figures in the critical genealogy tradition, Nietzsche and Foucault, no precise characterization is provided of the alternate ideal to be attained. Critical genealogies do not define the next step to be taken or the next stage to be obtained for oneself and society. They call for a transformation and give some indications about what ultimately matters: human flourishing for Nietzsche, resistance to congealed and fixed power relations for Foucault, but they do not explicitly prescribe any ideal endpoint. Now, as you may know, Stanley Cavell defines moral perfectionism, specifically in its Emersonian version, as the constant tension towards a further state, one not yet realized or unattained, of oneself, society, and the world. Emersonian perfectionism, in his view, is characterized by a pattern of disappointment and desire. Disappointment with the self, society, and the world as they are, and desire to transform them into something better. Yet, Emersonian perfectionism is a perfectionism without perfection. Indeed, once the self, society, and the world have been transformed, the same pattern of disappointment and desire is reactivated, because there is always a further state to be attained, and no state of the self, society, and the world will ever actually be perfect. In this sense, Emersonian perfectionism, as Cavell construes it, is inherently self-critical, in the same way in which Nietzsche's genealogy is. Neither of them defines an ideal endpoint to reach. Instead, they both aim to incite us to engage in the work of transformation, of self and world remaking, while at the same time also trying to convince us, in a certain sense, to accept the necessary imperfection of ourselves and our society. So what I want to do in this paper is to argue that Nietzsche's genealogy of morality can be productively read as perfectionist in Cavell's sense. However, the crucial tasks of self and world remaking, which are often associated with critical genealogies, are only intelligible in relation to a dimension of Nietzsche's genealogical endeavor that has systematically gone unnoticed. The dimension of the we, or of the multiplicity of collective subjects that are, I argue, the real protagonists of Nietzsche's genealogy. So what I will do in the paper is that I begin by reconstructing the debate on Nietzsche's perfectionism as it has unfolded in the past 3 decades or so. I will then express my own dissatisfaction with the fact that the literature has tended to overly focus on Schopenhauer as educator at the expense of the genealogy of morality, causing scholars to construe Nietzsche's perfectionism in merely individualistic terms. By contrast, I will show that the genealogy is a perfectionist endeavor, and that at the heart of such endeavor lies the first person plural, the we. I thereby emphasize the relevance of we-making for a novel reading of Nietzsche's perfectionism, or for what we could call is genealogical perfectionism, and argue that Emersonian perfectionism constitutes in turn a crucial element of his genealogical practice. I will briefly conclude that the analysis of the perfectionist dimension of Nietzsche's genealogy provides us with a convincing way of construing his perfectionism in non-individualistic terms. Okay, so let's start with the first part of the paper. Nietzsche's perfectionism is far from being an overlooked topic in the literature, especially in the wake of John Rawls' criticism of it in A Theory of Justice, and Stanley Cavell's response defending Nietzsche in Conditions Handsome and Unhandsome. This debate, however, precisely because it was initiated and largely shaped by Rawls' criticism, has so far mostly revolved around the early text Rawls relies on, which is section 6 of Nietzsche's 1876 essay, Schopenhauer as Educator. And therefore, this debate has kind of tended to ignore other potentially relevant sources. This is also true of Cavell's response to Rawls, at least in Conditions Handsome and Unhandsome, even though in another book, This New Yet Unapproachable America, Cavell does devote a couple of pages to a discussion of Emersonian themes in the preface of the Genealogy of Morality. Cavell there explained that it was Jim Conant who suggested assigning Schopenhauer as educator instead of the Genealogy of Morality to the students at Harvard. And in fact, a few years later, Conant himself published a long essay on Nietzsche's perfectionism in Schopenhauer as educator. And so what I try to do in this paper is, in a sense, to suggest a counter move and shift the attention again from Schopenhauer as educator back to the genealogy, thus, in a sense, following Cavell's initial intuition, in order to emphasize a non-individualistic aspect of Nietzsche's perfectionism, and at the same time, the perfectionism inherent to his genealogical project. In her book, Individuality and Beyond, Benedetta Zavatta reconstructs the profound influence that Ralph Waldo Emerson's writing exerted on Nietzsche throughout his life. Nietzsche starts reading Emerson at a very young age and admires him enormously, to the point of considering him as a brother soul. Referring to Emerson's essays, Nietzsche famously writes that he has, quote, never felt so much at home in a book and in my home. In fact, as Cavell and Conant convincingly argue, the real exemplar Nietzsche is thinking of in Schopenhauer as educator is actually Emerson. Schopenhauer is not mentioned very often, and it's striking that Emerson's presence and influence is pervasive throughout the text. I will mention a few examples throughout the paper. Thus, we can say that Cavell's response to Rawls is not only a defense of Nietzsche, but a defense of Emerson as well. Two main positions dominate the literature on Nietzsche's perfectionism. On the one hand, Rawls offers a reading of Nietzsche's perfectionism in section 50 of A Theory of Justice that construes it as essentially elitist and anti-democratic. And I'm going to read the citation that you have here. So this is from Rawls' A Theory of Justice. So far, I've said very little about the principle of perfection. Rawls writes, there are two variants. In the first, it is the sole principle of a teleological theory directing society to arrange institutions and to define the duties and obligations of individuals so as to maximize the achievement of human excellence in art, science, and culture. The principle obviously is more demanding the higher the relevant ideal is pitched. The absolute weight that Nietzsche sometimes gives the lives of great men such as Socrates and Goethe is unusual. At places, he says that mankind must continually strive to produce great individuals. We give value to our lives by working for the good of the highest specimens. And in a footnote that he adds here, Rawls refers to a specific passage drawn from section 6 of Schopenhauer as educator. So once again, Rawls, who is citing Nietzsche here, particularly striking is Nietzsche's statement, quote, mankind must work continually to produce individual great human beings. This and nothing else is the task. For the question is this, how can your life, the individual life, retain the highest value, the deepest significance? Only by your living for the good of the rarest and most valuable specimens. End quote. Of course, Rawls rejects this view, which he construes as the idea that most people should subordinate the pursuit of their own good to the aim of maximizing the good of a few elected specimens. Conceived in these terms, Nietzschean perfectionism is clearly elitist, inegalitarian, and anti-democratic, whereas for Rawls, claims of justice and equality should always come before claims of excellence. On the other hand of the debate, so there have been a few kind of scholars following Rawls in this interpretation of Nietzsche. On the other hand of the debate, without denying that Nietzsche's views are characterized by aristocratic aspects, Cavell and Conant defend a reading of Nietzsche's perfectionism in Schopenhauer as educator, inspired by Emerson democratic perfectionism. According to them, Nietzsche's perfectionisms, like Emerson, far from being radically incompatible with democracy, is essential to democratic life because it allows for and encourages an incessant internal critique of democracy itself. Indeed, Cavell and Conant claim that if there's anything that Nietzsche aims to maximize, it is genius, which, following Emerson, he considers to be equally distributed in each and every individual. Thus, genius is not the product of innate talents that only a few people possess. It is rather a capacity that everyone possesses and that consists in making the most of one's unique qualities. In this sense, all individuals are by nature capable of perfecting themselves, since everyone can attain their own higher self. As Nietzsche claims in Human All Too Human, quote, everyone has his good days when he finds his higher self. In short, Nietzsche is not suggesting, according to Cavell and Conant, that society should strive to maximize the good of a few selected specimens, but instead, through education and culture, the genius in each and every individual. Now, the crux of the interpretive dispute revolves clearly, or at least in part, around Rawls' reliance on a dubious translation of the relevant passage from Schopenhauer as educator, and more precisely of the word exemplare, which Cavell and Conant translate as exemplars instead of specimens. So I put here the passage with a different translation. How can your life, the individual life, receive the highest value, the deepest significance? Certainly only by your living for the good of the rarest and most valuable exemplars, and not for the good of the majority. That is to say, those who, taken individually, are the least valuable exemplars. In Schopenhauer as educator, Nietzsche continues, clearly drawing from Emerson's essays, quote, this is from Nietzsche, section 6 of Schopenhauer as educator. By coming to this resolve, he places himself within the circle of culture, for culture is the child of each individual's self-knowledge and dissatisfaction with himself. Anyone who believes in culture is thereby saying, I see above me something higher and more human than I am. Let everyone help me to attain it, as I will help everyone who knows and suffers as I do, so that at last the man may appear who feels himself perfect and boundless in knowledge and love, perception and power, and who, in his completeness, is at one with nature, the judge and evaluator of things. It is hard to create in anyone this condition of intrepid self-knowledge because it's impossible to teach love. For it is love alone that can bestow on the soul not only a clear, discriminating, and self-contemptuous view of itself, but also the desire to look beyond itself and to seek with all its might for a higher self, as yet still concealed from it. Relying on this passage, Cavell and Conant argue that the exemplar that Nietzsche is talking about here is not necessarily another person, but one's own higher self. Indeed, if other people often do play a role in the movement of self-perfection, it is by inspiring us to go beyond the current state of ourself and to attain a further, higher state of it. The desire to place ourselves in what Nietzsche calls the circle of culture is triggered by the encounter with an exemplar who, in turn, triggers a process of self-knowledge and self-dissatisfaction, thus inciting us to overcome ourself as it currently is and to move in the direction of our further, next, unattained but attainable self. In short, Cavell reads Nietzsche as claiming not that there is a genius such that every self is to live for it, but that for each self there is a genius. Thus, to serve as an exemplar for someone else merely means to be a person whose character and way of life place a demand on others to emulate one in a non-imitative fashion, or better, to discover within oneself further yet unattained but attainable possibilities. Thus, Nietzsche's perfectionism, like Emerson's, is in a sense indispensable to democracy, according to Cavell. Or better, as Cavell puts it, it turns out to be necessary if one wants to deal with the inevitable, incessant disappointment one experiences with the actual state of our democracies. How are we to keep the democratic hope alive in the face of this unavoidable disappointment? How are we to deal with democracy's failures while struggling to make democracy better, to push it closer and closer to its ideal? In Cavell's view, we need a way of bridging the gap between the ideal and real justice, or in other words, a way of inhabiting this gap while incessantly working towards the realization, one never fully attainable, of democracy itself. Emersonian and Nietzschean perfectionism express precisely this democratic aspiration by emphasizing the tension and struggle not only between myself as it is and myself as it may become, but also and thereby between society as it stands and society as it may become. It is therefore an integral part of our training for democracy, which is in a sense a training for self-criticism. Indeed, in Cavell's reading of Emersonian and Nietzschean perfectionism, self-reliance, understood as the aversion to conformity, does not consist in turning away from, but in turning towards society, in constant confrontation and conversation with it, expressing dissatisfaction with it, but also the conviction that the gap that separates and will always separate us from the actual realization of an ideal state of justice can nevertheless be made inhabitable. Good. So while I'm transition to the second part of the paper. While I'm broadly sympathetic with Cavell's and Conant's reading of Emerson and Nietzsche's perfectionism, I also find it problematic in many respects, and above all, because it construes Nietzschean perfectionism in purely individualistic terms. The transformation of society and the world begins with and essentially relies on the transformation of the individual self, both in Cavell's reading and in Conant's reading. By contrast, I would like to argue that a shift from Schopenhauer as educator to the genealogy of morality allows us to emphasize a non-individualistic aspect of Nietzschean perfectionism that has so far gone radically unnoticed. And here, perhaps just just a parenthesis. In this paper, I'm not trying to argue for a general reading of Nietzsche as a philosopher, but more specifically on a dimension of what I take to be his perfectionism, especially in the genealogy, that I read as being non-individualistic and be compatible with a certain form of democratic perfectionism. I think that the question of whether we can read Nietzsche as a democratic thinker is more complicated. My answer would be no. I'm just interested in kind of emphasizing this specific possibility of reading a perfectionist aspect in Nietzsche that can help us think of a perfectionist dimension of genealogy more generally and of a genealogical dimension of perfectionism. But I'll be happy to talk more about this in the Q&A. So it is a commonplace in the literature to link perfectionism to the pursuit of individuality. The clearest example is perhaps David Mickick's book, The Romance of Individualism in Emerson and Nietzsche, where he argues that Emerson's and Nietzsche's perfectionisms rely on the judgment that human beings have so far largely failed to achieve individuality, such that pursuing it, which means pursuing freedom, originality, and integrity, constitutes the highest possible aim in one's life. Yet I argue that the first person plural, the we, is as, if not more relevant to Nietzschean perfectionism as the first person singular is. Vanessa Lam rightly points out that Nietzsche's notion of culture is not a private matter pertaining to the self, but a collective public struggle reflected in a cultivation of freedom as responsibility. In this paper, I take a different path and suggest that we turn our attention on the genealogy of morality, a move that is virtually absent in the literature on Nietzsche's perfectionism. The first person plural, indeed, plays a crucial role in Nietzsche's genealogy. Indeed, the book famously begins with the following sentences: "We are unknown to ourselves, we knowers, and with good reason. We have never looked for ourselves, so how are we ever supposed to find ourselves?" The genealogy, therefore, begins with we, not with I. In the preface, Nietzsche continues, quote, "Who are we in fact? We remain strange to ourselves out of necessity. We do not understand ourselves. What must confusedly mistake, we must confusedly mistake who we are. The motto, 'Everyone is further from himself,' applies to us forever. We're not knowers when it comes to ourselves." End quote. Cavell pertinently emphasizes the connection between the first paragraph of Nietzsche's genealogy and the first section of Schopenhauer as educator, where Nietzsche, drawing inspiration from Emerson's essay Experience, which begins with the question, "Where do we find ourselves?" asks, "How can we find ourselves?" Again, thus showing that a we is already there even in the earlier text. For both Emerson and Nietzsche, the process of finding ourselves, what they also call education, begins with a negative moment of aversion. which is to say, with a rejection of the current state of ourself and our life, and far from aiming to discover our true self, it consists in perpetually circulating from a state of ourself to another, further or higher state of it. As Cavell argues, the perfectionist standpoint postulates that the human self is always becoming, as on a journey, always partially in a further state. As I mentioned before, Emersonian and Nietzschean perfectionisms, in his view, are both predicated upon the idea that each one of us has a further or higher self to attain, but no final or last self to realize. The problem being precisely that we tend to take our current self as fixed and final, or better, as last. From this perspective, knowing ourselves, for Emerson as well as for Nietzsche, means first and foremost realizing that we are not what we take ourselves to be. Most of the time, we tend to evade our genius, which is to say, the task of attaining our further or higher selves, instead of settling, and instead we settle for conformity. Knowing ourselves, therefore, does not require introspection, which is one of the main forms of Christian asceticism, nor does it entail transcendence. It is instead a task or a path that takes place on the surface of ordinary human practices, one that involves self-transformation. Be yourself. All you are now doing, thinking, desiring is not you yourself, Nietzsche writes in Schopenhauer as Educator, once again echoing Emerson, and more precisely the final lines of Considerations by the Way, and the call to have the courage to be what we are. Being what we are here does not mean discovering who we truly are, but becoming who we want to be. It's not a matter of realizing a specific fixed self, but consists in opening up a space, unattained but attainable, of possibilities. Nietzsche's genealogy, I argue, is a critique of what we do think, value, and desire as moral creatures, which is to say, as creatures with a conscience that has been shaped by almost 2,000 years of Christianity. It's a way of showing us that our self is historical, and that if we want to find ourselves, we must actually reject our current self and transform or recreate it. In this sense, Nietzsche clearly construes his genealogy as a perfectionist endeavor. But there is more. The question that Nietzsche asks at the beginning of the genealogy is, how are we supposed to find ourselves, given that we are unknown to ourselves, we knowers? This use of the we is far from trivial in the text, which is punctuated from start to finish by expressions such as we knowers, we moderns, we philosophers, we psychologists, we godless anti-metaphysicians, and so on. The subject of the genealogy and its addressee, we could say, is a plural subject, one that, however, is not defined from the outset. This subject is a multiple subject that the genealogy itself aims to build by showing the reader that she, like everyone else, is not just a unique individual who should concern herself solely with the realization of her own personal genius, but that she is also, and above all, part of countless communities of multiple we's. Thus, finding oneself is not only a matter of attaining one's own higher self, but it also requires realizing that one is never one in isolation, but always necessarily one of many, part of a multiplicity of past, present, and future we's. Indeed, the multiplication of we's in the genealogy is a way of showing the reader that finding herself, knowing herself, requires recognizing the historical processes that have shaped herself together with the self of countless other people. In other words, the perfectionist task of self and world transformation, which is the main goal of Nietzsche's critical genealogy, is not an individual, but a collective one. This idea is already captured in Nietzsche's claim in Schopenhauer as Educator, according to which anyone who believes in culture, I'm quoting Nietzsche, is saying, I see above me, you have the quote here in the slide, I see above me something higher and more human than I am. I let everyone help me to attain it, as I will help everyone who knows and suffers as I do. The perfectionist's journey, in Nietzsche's view, cannot therefore be a merely individual or individualistic one, prompted by the encounter with or attraction toward an exemplar, be it one's own higher self or someone else. Instead, it is also and crucially a collective journey, one that begins with the realization that I'm always already part of an open-ended multiplicity of we's, and thus that finding myself through the transformation of myself, society, and the world necessarily entails building new ways of being together, new we's as the indispensable framework for the attempt to bridge the gap between society as it is and society as it may become. In Nietzsche's genealogy, it is clear that these we's do not define a privileged class or a superior elite, but both a condition that Nietzsche thinks all human beings share, we knowers, we moderns, we godless, and groups of people united by the aspiration to overcome such condition in the direction of a further or higher one, we philosophers, we free spirits. Note that these groups are, at least in principle, open to everyone. As Conant convincingly argues, even though Nietzsche might think that only a few of his readers will be able to actually understand him, he also thinks that this inability is self-imposed. In Human, All Too Human, Nietzsche rejects the idea of spiritual tyrants and speaks instead of the oligarchs of the spirit, who, despite all spatial and political division, quote, constitute a close-knit society whose members know and recognize each other. And he continues, the quote, you have it on the slide. The spiritual superiority, which formerly divided and created hostility, now tends to unite. How could the individual keep himself aloft and against every current swim along his own course through life if he did not see here and there others of his own kind living under the same conditions and take them by the hand in struggle against both the ochlocratic character of the half-spirited and the half-educated and the attempts that occasionally occur to erect a tyranny with the aid of the masses? The oligarchs of the spirit have need of one another, they have joy in one another, they understand the signs of one another. End quote. The we of we philosophers, of we free spirits, of we oligarchs of the spirit is certainly elitist in Nietzsche's mind. Yet, on the one hand, this aristocracy of culture need not be reserved from the outset to any specific individual on the basis of their class, ethnicity, or gender. And on the other, Nietzsche's genealogy shows us that even the members of this elitist we are at the same time part of a multiplicity of other we's. We're all moderns, we're all godless, etc. Thus, if Conant is right in arguing that Nietzsche writes to the self you are, but for the self you can or should become, I would add that he also writes for the we's that we can or should build, those we's who will one day be able to create new values and thereby transform society and the world. As Nietzsche argues in the preface to Human, All Too Human, quote, that free spirits of this kind could one day exist, I should wish to be the last to doubt it. I see them already coming slowly, and perhaps I should do something to speed their coming if I describe in advance under what vicissitudes, upon what path I see them coming. Amiya Srinivasan has recently argued that the word-making dimension of Nietzsche's genealogy relies on its capacity to reveal what our values and concepts do for us, which practices they emerge from and sustain, what possibilities they open or foreclose, and more importantly, the role that agential powers have played in the emergence and continued dominance of those concepts and values. By showing how our values and practices can be remade, however, Nietzsche's genealogy also reveals that no revolution of values is possible if conceived in merely individualistic terms. To remake our values, to remake society and the world, one always needs to work with others if one takes seriously Nietzsche's genealogy. The Nietzschean revaluation of all values is necessarily a collective endeavor. And I would suggest one that has not a lot of chances of success if conceived in too narrow elitist terms against what I think Nietzsche himself did. To the conclusion now, very quickly. On the one hand, the literature on Nietzsche's perfectionism has so far tended to exclusively focus on the aspect of it pertaining to what we could call self-remaking or self-transformation as a condition for word remaking. It has thereby construed Nietzsche's perfectionism in merely individualistic terms. On the other hand, the literature on critical genealogies, and more specifically on Nietzsche's genealogy, has highlighted its self and word-making goals while systematically ignoring its link with perfectionism. In this paper, I hope to have shown that the self-remaking and word-remaking constitute the main goals of both Nietzsche's perfectionism and of his genealogy of morality. And I've argued that addressing the genealogical aspect of his perfectionism, centered on the importance of the we, allows us to respond to the charge of individualism, while addressing the perfectionist dimension of his genealogy, and in particular emphasizing the we-making dimension of it, allows us to show that the transformation of oneself and the transformation of society and the world can happen only if they take the form of a collective endeavor. Nietzschean genealogy only works as a perfectionist endeavor on the condition of making its readers realize that their self is plural, that they are part of a multiplicity of we's, and that a new revolution of values can only be promoted by collective effort. Emersonian perfectionism, or the dimension of our moral, social, and political life that incites us to work on the tension between oneself and society as they stand and oneself and society as they may become, thus rendering this tension inhabitable while constantly striving to make things better. So Emersonian perfectionism is not and cannot be an individual or individualistic endeavor in the same way as the genealogical revaluation of value is not and cannot. In Daybreak, elaborating on the passage from Human All to Human I quoted a minute ago, Nietzsche criticizes a conception of philosophy as a kind of supreme struggle to possess the tyrannical rule of the spirit. In other words, the idea, quote, you have the quote on the slide, the idea that some such very fortunate, subtle, inventive, bold, and mighty man was in reserve, one only, was doubted by none, and several, most recently Schopenhauer, fancied themselves to be that one. To this individualistic conception of philosophy and of culture more generally, Nietzsche opposes, quote, a higher and more magnanimous basic feeling. What do I matter? Stands over the door of the thinker of the future, he writes. Here, the Nietzschean what do I matter is strikingly different from the whim that Emerson in Self-Reliance claims he would write on the lintels of the doorpost when his genius calls him. Indeed, Nietzsche's genealogy shows us that our self is inconceivable in isolation from the plurality of we's it is a part of, and that make it plural. And that our task, the perfectionist task, consists in creating new we's as the actual subjects or agents of change. This we-making dimension is an integral part of Nietzsche's perfectionism, or at least of the form it takes in the genealogy, and that we could call genealogical perfectionism. It indicates the necessity to go beyond the individual self, to acknowledge the existence of a multiplicity of open and mutually overlapping communities of which each individual is part, and to understand that attaining one's further or higher self is only possible if one works, along with others, toward the realization of a higher, better way of living together. This perfectionism inherent to Nietzsche's genealogy can also help explain why the latter does not prescribe any ideal endpoint. It doesn't because it is predicated upon a perfectionist dynamic guided by the normative but not normativistic call to make oneself, society, and the world better. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Daniele, for this very, very exciting and thought-provoking talk. You certainly brought new light into the genealogy. Thank you also for respecting the time. We now have plenty of time for discussion. And yeah, I would now ask the audience if there are questions or commentaries. I see that Elder already has raised his hand. Elder, please.
Thank you very much, Daniele. It was a pleasure to hear you again and to see you again and to think about Emerson and now Nietzsche again with you. The presentation was very interesting for me, very stimulant to think about this social dimension of the genealogy and to read it through this Emersonian Cavalian lens. So this was very stimulating, and it touched several points that I'm also very concerned with. So it was very helpful. I have two questions that concern some difficulties that I have when I try to look at the text from these angles, from this angle. And the first one concerns the idea of perfectionism itself, of this striving towards improved state, the idea of a higher self. And I was wondering if it isn't also important to consider that in Nietzsche, at some point, the question is not so much a question of improving my current state, which could assume that I'm using the inner logic of my current state, but more a question of destroying my state and creating something new. So I wonder if there isn't a dimension of enhanced alterity that might not become very clear if you talk simply about improving oneself. And so there's even this idea of overhuman or Übermensch as a new species. And at this point, and this touches my second question, I'll come to it after mentioning the second question, that concerns this idea of the collective dimension of the self and the collective dimension of this transformation. So I find it very convincing that we cannot transform, one cannot transform oneself without transforming others, especially because of this anthropology of the will to power, how we ourselves are a collectivity, and our collectivity is in constant dialectics or constant tension with other collectivities, other wills to power. So we have to transform the whole system as much as possible, and not just something that takes place within me. But we could still see this as being just a condition of my own individualistic transformation. And this seems to connect with the idea that Nietzsche has, that each individual can ultimately have their own values, and there's no uniform system we could work together and develop together as our own system, which could be suggested by what you were saying. I don't know if it was an intention of yours or not, but it seems that the collective dimension of self-transformation is just part of the story. There seems to be still a very strong individualistic trait in the project. This was partially connected with what I was mentioning about the overhuman and the idea of sacrificing oneself for a higher form of human being. So it seems that there's also this elitistic trait that many people will just be part of the transit of the transformation to something higher. So these were the thoughts I have while hearing you, but thanks again.
Thank you so much. Marta, do I respond after each question?
As you prefer. Do you have a preference? Normally we do Q&A directly.
Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect. So thanks so much, Helder, for these questions. They're great, and I agree with both. So let me start with the second one, because I think that the answer is relatively easier there. I agree with you. I think that, like, so in a sense, my concerns in this paper are less to offer an interpretation of Nietzsche's own political project than to show that I think the genealogy as a text, and I think genealogy as a method, necessarily, kind of emphasizes the importance of the we and of this kind of collective transformation that impedes, in a certain sense, to read the perfectionist transformation as a purely individual or individualistic one. I do agree with you that it's, one can argue, well, for Nietzsche, like the end results anyway, what matters is the individual, like, and I guess I have nothing to respond to that. But at the same time, I would say that within his genealogical project, it seems to me, you necessarily need to insert a dimension of, like, values can be reevaluated and transformed only if one is able to see oneself as part of a collectivity within which one has to work, and one has to kind of, the creation of something new, the creation of new values can only happen within that kind of collectivity. And as I was saying, at some point, I think that collectivity cannot be just a very restricted elite. I think that the genealogy itself shows us that a successful transvaluation of values can only happen if enough people, enough groups within a society take on, like a new way of valuing things. And so I think it's an interesting question to ask how much this, which I take to be a kind of internal working of genealogy as a method, goes against the grain of some things that Nietzsche himself thought for himself. But it's a kind of slightly different question than the question that I tried to pose in the paper. But I think it's kind of a continuation of what I'm doing here, right? So, so what I hope the paper does, and in the longer version, I hope I make this slightly clearer, is to show that in a certain sense, like there are certain features of genealogy as a method that work towards conclusions that maybe Nietzsche himself would not have subscribed to, but that's part of the reasons why I'm interested in genealogy as a method itself. On your first question, I completely agree. I think that there's a risk in a certain way of conceiving perfectionism to bracket the idea of creation as a rupture instead of creation as just like it going from one state that a kind of immanent transformation that still preserves some aspects of the past. That's for sure the reading of perfectionism and the kind of interpretation of perfectionism that Cavell gives. Cavell is very interested in this idea of a movement that is not a dialectical one, but it does maintain elements of the past within it. And I'm working on Fanon right now, which I think is much closer to these elements of Nietzsche, where Nietzsche emphasizes creation as a more radical rupture. And I think that those elements, are not straightforwardly compatible with Cavell's construction of perfectionism. But they are compatible with, I think, a larger version or a broader version of perfectionism that we can think about if we take perfectionism just to be the striving towards, like a better society and a better world. And that's precisely what Fanon tries, he's trying to do in his writings. And in certain conditions, such as conditions of colonialism, I think that Fanon is right in saying, you need a complete destruction and a radical break. And so it might just be a matter of saying, there are certain conditions that require a radical break and certain conditions that can accommodate a more, kind of immanent transformation. So I think that Cavell would go in the second sense, Fanon would go in the first, but perhaps we can talk about two different kinds of perfectionism there. Thank you.
Thank you also.
Thank you. Harvey Goldman had raised his hands on the screen. I've seen it, and only now virtually, but you were the first one.
Thank you. I want to raise a question about your interpretive framework by raising 2 points that I think are interrelated. One is that in Beyond Good and Evil, in a section called Was ist Vornehm, what is high-ranking or what is noble, Nietzsche seems to move his discussion toward the formation of nobility. He admires various kinds of nobilities around the globe, throughout time. And in that sense, seems to be aiming toward a formation of certainly not an isolated kind of figure, but if it is a group, it is certainly an elite group of a certain kind, so that in that sense, he is still, or once again, might be a better way to put it, thinking about the formation of a very unique group, which I think is worth taking into account. And it leads me to my second point, which I think may be related to it, and it is with how to think about the use of the plural singular, well, it can't be plural singular, but the plural nominative, whatever I call it, I've suddenly blanked. That is we, because I wonder to what extent we should take the we as the kind of more general philosophical notion of we, which is understandable in whether semantic or syntactical terms, and whether in fact he means a we that refers rather locally to people like Paul Ray, to Lou Andreas Salome, that refers in a way to those with whom he feels himself in a kind of dialogue. Of course, his ambition, despite the fact that his works don't circulate very well, is to find a larger kind of audience. But I'm just wondering whether the we is, in that sense, directed toward those who are already, in his sense, we philosophers, or we seekers after self or things of that sort. So I'm just wondering whether these, both the issue of nobility and the issue of we should be made a little more confined. Thanks.
Thank you so much. These are
Daniele,
great questions. Yep.
Maybe I would add also a small commentary, because I also had a question that is very close to the one that Harvey just posed, which has to do with this the interpretation you make of the personal pronoun we, or of Nietzsche's use of we. There is some discussion in Nietzsche literature about that, and you seem to assume an inclusive meaning of we, in a sense that when Nietzsche uses we, he refers to we, all of us, all his readers. But there is also an exclusive use of we, in the sense that he might be using it in contrast to all of you. We, the selected ones, the free spirits, the oligarchs of the spirit, or the argonauts of the ideal, as he says in the gay science. And in this sense, it is an exclusive use. I don't know if you can say exclusive, but it's an elitist use of we, which contrasts with everybody else. And it's a very difficult, because indeed in English or in German, also in Portuguese, I imagine it in Italian as well, you can't really decide. You can indeed make use, you can use we in both ways. And considering all the other positions we know by Nietzsche, some of them you quoted at the beginning, also what Harvey just mentioned, is cult of the nobility of superior human beings. It is easier to think that Nietzsche is indeed using this exclusive use of we. And there is also this, some defend that Nietzsche uses the pronoun we as a selective device, in the sense that he, through the word we, is trying to select the readers that are able to have to be also free-spirited or noble, but in principle he would not be addressing himself to the herd, to the common human beings, but only to those who would follow his steps and become free-spirited philosophers. And so I wanted to know how you react to this different way of understanding we.
It's great. Thank you. So I do have a footnote where I try to address some of these problems. And like, so of course it's an interpretive problem, but up to a certain point, I think it's a problem that has to be, I personally think that it's a problem that has to be, discussed almost case by case, because I do think that it's very clear that Nietzsche makes an exclusive use of we in certain contexts, and I don't think it's particularly controversial. And of course, it's hard to understand, like for every use that he makes of we in the genealogy, what kind of use is he making. But at the same time, like when he talks about we moderns, for instance, or we godless, or we knowers, so in a way that is less kind of pitched towards, like a specific elite of culture. So it does seem that there are some inclusive uses of it. And at the same time, I kind of follow Conant in saying, even when there are exclusive uses of the we, the exclusive use that Nietzsche makes of, like we free spirits, is just thinking of a very specific set of people and a specific elite. I think that part of what the genealogy does is to show that up to a certain point, like there's no philosophical reason to restrict who in principle can be a free spirit. So even once again, like I'm less interested in what Nietzsche actually thought than in like what the philosophical implications of what he's doing are. And I think that up to a certain point, well, this is something that Conant has argued, I think, pretty convincingly, like there's no indication. So the way in which you make the we exclusive is like something that doesn't come from the method itself or from philosophical reasons. And a priori, it seems like even the we of we free spirits, for the genealogy itself to make sense, has to be a we that has to be inclusive, at least a priori, even though, like you might say, not everyone will become a free spirit, sure, but for the genealogy as an endeavor and a critical endeavor to actually work, I think that it's fair to assume that Nietzsche should assume in his readers, at least in some of them, the capacity to transform themselves from non-free spirit to a free spirit. And if you assume that a priori, you're not going to pick and choose, like a priori everyone could. Doesn't mean that everyone will, but it means that, like in a certain sense, if Nietzsche makes an exclusive use of we, just thinking about specific people and not thinking that a reader could also transform himself into a free spirit by reading his book, I think Nietzsche is working against himself and against his own method. So that's where, like to go back to Arvi's question, I think that both comments are absolutely correct and on point. And once again, like what I try to do in the paper is less, an interpretive move in terms of how we should read Nietzsche's own intentions, and more an interpretive move of, if we take seriously the movement of a text, which is the genealogy itself, it seems to me that we can find indications to counter, like this, this idea that, like the politics behind it, like behind the kind of critique that the genealogy performs, is necessarily an aristocratic one, or behind the use, like of the we that it does, there's necessarily, like the idea of Nietzsche just referring to those with whom is already in a dialogue. So I think that these questions help me making clear that I have to make this point clearer in the paper. But I would still try to say something like, I'm not a Nietzsche scholar first and foremost, and I'm not necessarily interested in the debates about Nietzsche himself or what he really thought. I think that there's something in the genealogy itself that like can work up to a certain point independently from its author. And perhaps here I'm being very Foucauldian, like in this claim, like there's something in the method itself and in the way in which the book is construed that that can give us indications, like to go in a sense of interpreting it in a perfectionist sense and in an anti-individualistic sense. And those are the things that I'm most interested in, partly because I think that genealogy is so important as a critical method for us, that I want up to a certain point to rescue it from certain conclusions or certain positions that Nietzsche, as a scholar, as a philosopher himself, took, if this makes sense. But your questions are, of course, correct. I'm not denying those. I'm just trying to situate myself on a slightly different plane.
We have two further questions. Pedro Dotto.
Thank you very much, Daniele, for this very insightful and thought-provoking discussion. I really enjoyed it. So I have one comment and one question. My comment is the following. I think that a perfectionist reading of Nietzsche's Zarathustra can actually further enhance and strengthen your argument that the we condition is not only the we dimension is not only a condition of the perfectionist endeavor, but also its end goal, its target. Because Zarathustra, after all, he did not concern himself only with self-transformation, but he went down back to the city. So there is a catabasis. He underwent a critical self-transformation, but he's also interested in a world transformation. He goes down more than once to teach and try to give some light and awaken others to this critical task. I know that it doesn't add to your genealogical point on your talk. The genealogy as a critical method might be missing the Zarathustra, but as you spoke also the daybreak, to human, this could also be a further evidence to strengthen your point that the perfectionist lines in Nietzsche also imply a we dimension, a collective effort. So this is just a suggestion. And my question is more, it ties to Elder's question as well on values. And it's a problem that I have with Cavell's, more or less a problem that I have with Cavell's concept of Emersonian perfectionism, of this perfectionist without perfection. Because even though I'm interested in this concept, I often ask myself, what are the criteria to be employed in this journey, the perfectionist journey, both the criteria for criticism and self-criticism, but also the criteria that one can consider to know if one has made progress, if there has been some measure of success along this journey in this task of self-transformation. Because Cavell speaks all the time about this attainment of this unattainable self, further states, higher states, more elevated. But how do we measure if it's more elevated, if you're making progress, if you're going downwards, or if you're achieving success, or if you're making a regression? So what is the method, the criteria to solidify this? And with this, I just add a provocation, which is Callicles in Plato's Gorgias. Couldn't he be considered along Cavellian lines as involved with Emersonian perfectionism? Does Emersonian perfectionism need or has a more substantial or thick ethical values behind it, or is just a movement from self-satisfaction to self-transformation, self-dissatisfaction to self-transformation without any criteria to assess it? Because if it doesn't have, as I don't know what is your thought about it, then Callicles could be rightly considered to be a Emersonian perfectionism, because he's dissatisfied with his current self. He wants to be a tyrant. He wants to be less and less concerned with other people think about him. He wants to give rise to his desire and fulfill his desire in any way he feeds to, because this is his conception of the law of nature, and he considers himself to be a strong man. That's what he wants to become. So is Callicles an Emersonian perfectionism?
Thank you. This is great. Thank you for the first comment as well, which is very helpful, and for the question and provocation, which is a crucial question and also a very slippery and complicated one. So the way that I have to square this problem, which I don't care if Cavell would agree or not, but is to say something like this. There's a difference between a search for a priori criteria or groundings for something and a kind of normative impulse. So I think that perfectionism, moral perfectionism, much like Foucauldian genealogy, cannot have any a priori criteria to establish whether, one is actually like going in the right direction or not. But I think that this doesn't mean that it's completely a perpetual relativistic movement, like that has no direction. And I think that it's not like that, because I think that it has a normative impulse that is related to the idea of creating a state that of the self and of society that allows for the maximum flexibility and opportunities for further transformations is, to me, the kind of normative impulse that this movement itself possesses. In other words, if you're transforming yourself and the world and society in a state that, instead of opening up more possibilities for further transformations, closes them down or fixes them, or kind of, you make yourself into, like a tyrant, or you make society into a tyranny where, like only one can be free and all of the others have to obey, et cetera, et cetera. I think that is the sign that, in a certain sense, like the direction is not the right one, right? So it's in a sense an argument that says the normative impulse within perfectionism is just the minimal one of being able to always keep the transformation going. And in order to always keep the transformation going, like you have to move in the direction of the creation of more possibilities instead of less. And this is an argument that I use also to interpret Foucault. So there are many criticisms, of course, of Foucault as saying, like, well, it doesn't have any normative grounding, like we cannot really understand how a certain state is better than another if power is everywhere. And my response to that is that, like there's a sense in which the normative impulse in Foucault's work goes towards the kind of making power relations as flexible and malleable as possible. So not getting rid of power, because that's not possible, but always and constantly fighting against the fixation or the fixity of things. And I would interpret the normative impulse within perfectionism in the same vein. So no criteria. Habermas is going to be upset, and Fraser and everyone else, but a kind of normative impulse to actually keep multiplying the possibilities for transformation. And I think that this is linked with in necessary optimism that, like, anyone who espouses perfectionism has to have, like, the optimism of, like, we will get things right in the end. We might get things wrong at a certain point, but if we keep the perfectionist impulse alive, we will always try then to transform the things that we got wrong, like in the direction of more and more possibilities for the future. Yeah. I don't know if it's convincing. I'm sure that it's not convincing to everybody, but it's the best answer that I've got so far.
Okay. Last question by Rogério Lopes.
Hi, everyone. You can hear me?
Yes,
Yeah?
yes.
Okay. Thank you, Danielle, for your very stimulating talk. I think that you give us more engaging, compelling, perhaps more interesting and even more plausible Nietzsche, but I'm not sure if you give us also the most historically accurate Nietzsche, so to speak. And I'm not sure if it doesn't matter for you too. I think it's not your main point. But anyway, my question is about your main evidence for your claim that genealogy is a collective task. I think that the evidence you suggest is perhaps when Nietzsche uses this plural pronoun, he is more interested to call attention for his contemporaries for the descriptive and explanatory task of genealogy as a research program, instead of include them in the more ambitious, this high ambitious task of transvaluation of values or something like that. This kind of text, it's very unusually ambitious, and Nietzsche meant that only these philosophers, lawgivers are able to accomplish this. So I think that behind my question is another perhaps more important question about genealogical methodology that has to do with how you see or how you interpret this insistence by Nietzsche on the difference between the genealogy as a merely preparatory work for this another more ambitious work of transvaluation. So if this is the point, then I would say that there is no normative, or at least not much significant in normative dimension of genealogy itself. So the genealogy is just a tool for the philosophical work or the philosophical task. And so I think you could think of one thing is that we who will be responsible for do the genealogical work, the preparatory work of describing, explain our values, our moral values. The other we would be the we who will be the agents of the transvaluation, and then we have another we, which will be the bearers of the perfectionist values, and that's the last group. It's very, very restricted one in Nietzsche's view. So that's my point. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And so it's a very interesting question and a very broad one. Of course, as you said at the beginning, you know, like my point is not necessarily to retrace the most historically accurate Nietzsche. It's more to see in what ways we can appropriate a certain moves that Nietzsche makes, especially in the genealogy, for, you know, like some debates and for some things that I'm interested in personally. And I agree with you that there's this debate, you know, like, is genealogy just preparatory work, or is genealogy already, in a certain sense, the first step of the transformation? It's a very interesting and a very complicated question. My reading of the text is that even though Nietzsche does say that it's or suggest that it's just a preparatory work, I tend to interpret it as the first step of the transformation of values itself. Why? Because what Nietzsche does in the text is to show us the ways in which an actual transformation of values in the past had the chance to be successful and to be taken up and to kind of, become, like, or like to establish an actual new set of values. And I think that so there are some readings of Nietzsche's genealogy as kind of reverse engineering, and like I don't necessarily follow those readings, but I think that there's a sense in which Nietzsche is not just preparing the terrain, but is also like showing us what things do we have to pay attention to in order for a new reevaluation of values to be successful. And if that's the case, I do think that, the genealogy itself, or the kind of collective dimension of the text, works on both levels, both on the level of the group of those who are preparing the terrain, but also on the level of the agents that will actually have to put the transformation into into work. In terms of the third group that you mentioned, and in terms of the kind of normative or non-normative import of the work, I do think that the genealogy as a text itself say very little about what we can expect from, like what Nietzsche hopes to be a new transformation or transvaluation of values. And I think that this is a feature of the method itself. I don't think it's a problem, however, because of what I was saying before in my response to Pedro. So I think that, like you don't necessarily have to talk about normativity just in terms of normative criteria, but you can also talk about normativity in terms of a normative force or a normative impulse inherent in the method itself. So these are just a few ideas. Like it's a very broad question, one that I'm not sure I can address entirely in this paper. But it was very helpful for you to spell out these three groups and three steps, because I think that you're onto something that is important. And I will think more about it. So thank you.
Okay, great. It's already over midnight in Tokyo, so we really need to close this session and let Daniele rest. Thank you so much, Daniele, once again for this very interesting talk and discussion. Thank you also for all of you for being there and having contributed for the discussion. We'll be back on April 17 with a talk by Ipe de Boer. And I hope to see you then. Thanks again to all of you, and especially to Daniele.
Thank you so much for your questions. It was very helpful.
Thank you. Bye.
Good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Good night. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.